Hello, I'm Bill Bullard with R-CALF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, back in April, R-CALF USA and 18 other cattle organizations sent a letter to Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack asking him for an investigation into the huge cattle and beef trade imbalance the United States has with Canada and Mexico under the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. And we pointed out that the United States imports 2.5 times the value of cattle and beef from Canada and Mexico than we export to those countries. And in terms of quantity, we import 3.5 times more than we export. Now that's a problem. When you buy 2.5 times more than you sell, your checkbook is soon to run empty. But Secretary Vilsack doesn't see it that way. In his response letter received recently, Secretary Vilsack claims that without the USMCA, U.S. agriculture would be dramatically smaller and would see less economic activity in rural America without access to these markets. He further claims that his agency actively reviews the regulatory environment for imported cattle and cattle products and is committed to ensuring trade is fair and equitable for American producers and consumers. And finally, the Secretary doubled down on his support for the World Trade Organization and the USMCA. So needless to say, the Secretary's response was hugely disappointing. It's clear the Secretary does not care that the U.S. cattle industry is being buried under a mountain of cheaper, undifferentiated imports. And it's likewise clear that he wants to keep it that way. Now, this Washington, D.C. mindset that all trade is good regardless of whether it dismantles domestic supply chains is precisely why China now presents such a serious economic threat to our country. For decades, we ignored the horrendous trade imbalance with China, and now we're scrambling to figure out how to begin making things in our own country again, after we've already dismantled our nation's production capabilities. So let's look at how imports are contributing to the shrinking and dismantling of the U.S. live cattle supply chain. If we look at a chart of monthly beef imports from around the world since the start of the 21st century, a period of just over 2 decades, an alarming pattern emerges. See, world beef imports increased for the first 8 years of this century, and then they began to fall in mid-2007, and they continued to fall for about 7 years until early 2014. So beginning in early 2014, beef imports began steadily increasing, and they continue increasing through today. So visually, what we see over the past 2 decades is a valley of low beef imports between 2 peaks of high beef imports. And can you guess what your domestic cattle prices did during that distinct valley of low imports? Well, they climbed, and they climbed dramatically. They climbed during that entire 7 to 8 year valley when imports were low. In fact, in the middle of that valley, beef imports fell to the lowest level in over 2 decades, and that was 2011. And during 2011, fed cattle prices gained an additional $15 per hundredweight. 2011 was also the year the United States cattle and beef trade deficit was reduced to the smallest level in over 2 decades. It was the year that we almost sold more cattle and beef to the rest of the world than we bought from it. Now, had our trade with Canada and Mexico been brought into balance, the United States would have experienced its first trade surplus with the rest of the world. But it didn't happen, and soon our trade deficit began worsening again. So what does this historical look at changes in the volume of beef imports tells us? Well, it tells us that Secretary Vilsack is wrong, terribly wrong. It tells us that higher cattle prices are associated with lower beef imports. And when we have higher cattle prices, our domestic live cattle supply chain begins to prosper. It grows, and it creates more economic activity in rural America. So how do we get there from here? How do we rebalance the cattle and beef trade with Canada and Mexico and with the rest of the world? For certain, we can't keep doing what we're doing. The first and most important step is for Congress to pass a mandatory country of origin labeling bill, what we call an MCOOL bill, to require all beef sold in America to be labeled as to where the animal was born, raised, and harvested. Now, this is the only way U.S. cattle producers can compete in the domestic market, where today packers and importers, not cattle producers and consumers, decide how much beef imports will enter the U.S. market to displace domestic beef production. We need your support. We need your help. So please go to our website at r-cafusa.com to become a member so you can help us pass mandatory country of origin labeling in Congress this year. With that, have a productive week. Thank you and goodbye.